Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Living Ancestor Podcast. This is your host, Ramon Castellanos, and today we are going to be exploring the ways in which we fetishize the various layers of the ancestral in order to be able to create a touchstone, a focal point of connection, but how that same touchstone and focal point of connection can, if we mistake it for the entirety of the force that we are engaging with, deeply limit us and overall reduce the ancestral in scope in a way that is actually not helpful. And we're going to do this in 3 separate phases in order to keep the transmission coherent, because it's a pretty deep and complex topic that I'm going to do my best to simplify for you so that you can actually move forward with perhaps a little bit broader and expanded of a relationship to the ancestral. So the first phase, we're just going to talk about what I mean by fetishizing and fetishes in general. Then we're going to talk about how that shows up for us as modern people within the context of the ancestral, and then we're going to go into an expansion phase and talk about the ancestral in a broader scope and really discuss what it is and what it contains, because the ancestral is actually quite vast and not limited to any of the fetishes that we create about it. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive in. The notion of a fetish is one that at a core level describes an orientation of consciousness. And this orientation is that it is about being devoted to an object, an idea, or a behavior. The interesting thing about this, though, is that a fetish is also a narrowing of scope. It is a focal point. Some might even call it a container. And in this way, the container is often something that represents or holds an aspect of a very multi-layered force or dynamic. So, by this, we can look into indigenous cultures, and I'm sure you've heard of the notion of a fetish as a magical object. And if you haven't, in certain indigenous cultures, the word fetish, or at least the equivalent in their language, is used to describe something like a spirit house, perhaps a doll, or some other object that has been sculpted out of a material like wood, perhaps, or a multimedia kind of object that is layered together and then imbued with magical force. And in this way, it's meant to represent something like a god, a force, or an ancestor. So if you imagine a shrine with various objects that represent spirits and or gods, each one of those objects could be thought of and is referred to in some contexts as a fetish. Again, it's a container, a focal point, and a touchstone. Because the fetish itself is not the totality of the force. It might represent the force, but it is not the whole of it. It is a way for human beings to create a relatable container to said force that we can access on a consistent basis in order to work with it. Because many of the forces that are imbued into fetishes are so vast in scope and so multi-dimensional that we can't truly, totally understand and apprehend them, but we can give them this touchstone and give us this touchstone in order to relate to them in a palpable way. Now, this is where even the notion of a sexual fetish comes in, because those fetishes are an excessive devotion, one might say. I suppose it depends on who you ask, but that's how it's often categorized, is an excessive devotion to a object, to a idea, or to a behavior. Now, what we have with that is the narrowing of scope of the immense power of sexuality into this particular orientation. But the notion of a fetish is one that can expand beyond all of these ideas. And what I want to share with you today is to think about a fetish as any time that we objectify and narrow in scope something in order to define it and to be able to relate with it in a palpable way. It's kind of like building an icon to something, and icons and fetishes are very similar in this way. And this is something that we are doing in the context of the ancestral in our culture consistently, and often by necessity. As I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, fetishes are helpful because they allow us to relate to something in a palpable way that is often vast in scope. So, what does this look like in the context of the ancestral? Well, it's funny enough that I actually wrote a book at one point attempting to address what I consider to be the limiting aspect of the fetish idea in the context of the ancestral for modern people. And the book was called The Ancestral Now, the intersection between deep time, primal movement, nutrition, magic, and ancestral consciousness. So the reason I wrote this book is because each one of those topics, as it relates to the ancestral, is a kind of fetish in this way, such as, let's say, ancestral nutrition. This is a fetishizing of one aspect of ancestral lifeways. The same could be said about primal movement or ancestral movement. It is a narrowing of scope of the ancestral into a manageable container that we can relate to. And again, even further than that, going to animism and working with the dead and ancestral healing in the context of working with spirits is also, in a way, a narrowing of the ancestral in order to relate to a particular aspect of it. And we can keep coming up with these kinds of examples. I don't want to dive too deeply into the example arena because we could keep going for hours. But suffice it to say that each one of these is a kind of fetish. Now, what's interesting is that in our world today, in modern times, we have to fetishize certain aspects of the ancestral, like, let's say, nutrition and movement and ancestral healing work, because those elements are missing from our world. Because in a tribal and indigenous context, where those fetishes are sourced from, in the sense, the root of them, then those things aren't really called ancestral. Because if you're eating a diet that is based in a particular land that your ancestors lived within, then you are by definition eating an ancestral diet, and at that point it's just food. The same thing with primal and ancestral movement. If you're moving like a wild creature in the wilderness, at that point it's just movement. And if you're engaged in an animate living tradition that belongs to your people, then there is almost certainly an ancestral veneration piece and a broadening of scope of what the ancestral even is at a spiritual level. And at that point, it's just spirituality at that point. So these things we fetishize in our world because we have to, because they are missing. But in doing so, we often narrow the scope of the ancestral drastically. There are enormous groups of people promoting ancestral nutrition under the guise of a niche marketing term that has been commodified, like the paleo diet, like the carnivore diet, or even ancestral nutrition. And these people, they relate to the ancestral purely through this fetish. So to them, the scope of the ancestral is held within diet. And this goes so far that I actually encountered a YouTube channel once called Ancestral Healing, And it was all about the carnivore diet. And to them, this fetish had narrowed so deeply in scope that the ancestral orientation towards food in and of itself could be summed up in the carnivore diet, which is just one possible iteration of ancestral nutrition and does not hold the scope of the way the ancestors related to food. But this is what we get when we fetishize. The attempt to narrow and to limit and to create a focal point that allows us to relate to something can become a kind of prison if we allow it. Now, the same is true for a lot of the ancestral health communities, people who promote things like the Paleolithic diet or some variation thereof, and then talk about, primal exercises like push-ups and lunges and squats and pull-ups, and they end up narrowing the scope of the ancestral way of life to these modernized versions of what we call nutrition and movement. And it's often in a way that's nostalgic and or attempting to recreate something that we can't actually recreate, because the real potency of those disciplines is to give us a reference point for modern people to act within the modern food and movement environment in a way that is a little bit more informed about what might be inherent and innate as a species. Now, I've also encountered this with spiritual teachers, who to them, the ancestral can be summed up in the dead, in our relationship to the dead and to ancestral spirits. And all the other elements of the ancestral lifeways are thrown out of the mix because they have their practices, they have their orientations, they have their models, and to them the way that they wrap the ancestral up in a nice, neat little bow that they can manage is by relating to the dead and to ancestral spirits. Now, there are more elements of the ancestral that we could talk about. As I said, I don't want to go into too many examples, but right now, if I were to ask you how the ancestral is manifesting for you, where would your mind immediately go? What small little dynamic, or possibly if it's not too small, if you've been involved in ancestral lifeways for a while, then it might be broader in scope. But nonetheless, if I asked you, how would you orientate towards that? And then I want to invite you to consider that that orientation is probably and possibly some kind of a fetish. And then I want to invite you to potentially expand beyond that to include what we're going to discuss now, that I want to go into what the ancestral actually is. And as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, the ancestral is vast, and hopefully by the end of this episode, you'll have a little bit more of a sense of just how vast it is. So let's go ahead and start off very simply with the body. Now, your body is an ancestral phenomenon. It literally came out of the ancestors in one continuous, unbroken line. And that means the design of the human body, every single aspect that is inherent and innate about the human body and its orientations, from the reptilian to the mammalian to the Homo sapien, is some kind of ancestral inheritance and or capacity. And in this way, there are designs built into how the creature that is the human body wants to eat in order to maintain health. There are orientations in terms of design and movement, things that the human body was designed to do in movement, certain actions that are actually built into the design. Think about walking as a very simple example of this. We are literally designed to walk. It's a part of the human architecture. It emerges out of our structure. And there's many other examples of this, from crawling to squatting to kneeling on the ground to running, even to climbing to dancing. Dancing doesn't have to be prompted for a lot of people. You listen to music and the body starts to move. These things are built in and innate. There are other things too that run really deep, like the desire for warmth, the desire for other human beings, the ability to read subtle nuanced features on people's faces in a way that's cross-cultural. The fear of the dark, wanting warmth, for example. All these things and many more are all ancestral patterns. They are literally built into the very lifeblood of what it means to be a human being in a human body. But now let's extend that further into what people often think of too in certain communities as ancestry, which is the people who came before you. Now, there is, of course, this layer of the remembered dead. That is the humans that you know of and that you can remember that existed before you that are a part of your lineage. But then if we go back even further than that, we go into the forgotten dead. And for a lot of us, that's not that far back. And then this can take us all the way back to the Paleolithic era, and then further back even into the non-human animals that are a part of our lineage, going all the way back, my friends, to the first life forms on this planet that emerged out of the ancient oceans. And if the notion that life was seeded from off this planet and came here on a comet or something like that is true, which is potentially probable, then we have a connection to lineage at the level of bloodline that goes even beyond planet Earth. But now let's come back to Earth and let's consider the land line. So we discussed the bloodline. Let's talk about our land line and the ways in which the lands that our ancestors inhabited and the lands that we have been a part of that have impacted us at the level of lineage that have shaped who we are, how those are a form of ancestor. And then going off of that, let's go to our soul line or our spirit line where we discuss the spiritual ancestors. And this could be those who have deeply impacted you because of a spiritual lineage or a spiritual tradition that you are potentially a part of. And make no mistake about it, every lineage, every spiritual tradition on earth is an ancestral tradition. Those are people who lived and died and who were ancestors to somebody. And possibly you in some cases. But even if we're not talking about bloodline, we're still talking about a spiritual ancestry that has been maintained and held by people who devoted their entire lives to a particular set of teachings, to embody those things, to transmit them across thousands of years, in some cases tens of thousands of years, which is incredible. Those people are ancestors. And what about your own potential journey as a soul through many lifetimes if you believe in reincarnation and potentially the soul allies that we have acquired in that process and how those are spiritual ancestors? And now let's look into a mythic line that connects us to the various mythologies of the world and to mythological creatures that might be a part of our ancestry, which is something that indigenous and tribal people have held to be true for long periods of time. Things like dragons, for example, or griffins, or other mythological forces that have become a part of family insignias, for example, and how indigenous people felt that they were often connected to spiritual beings that were not specifically human and that those were ancestors and they belonged to various clans that were not particularly human again. So from that perspective of just where we come from a bloodline, from a landline, from a soul line, and from a mythic line perspective, there's a lot going on there. Now, what about the cosmic line and your relationship to the entire cosmos? In some traditions, it is believed that God is the first ancestor, which is a very interesting idea, meaning that ancestry can take us all the way back to the source of reality itself. And in this way, we can think of the earth as an ancestor, but also the sun and the moon, the planets of the solar system, the stars, and as we now know, we all come from stardust, and our bodies are made of stardust, to the very beginning of all of the universe. So this is where we get the idea in various cultures, like in the Vedas, for example, that the entire physical universe is a great mother. Or we go back to certain Native American ideas of Mother Earth and Father Sky. And these kinds of orientations point us towards something that, from a certain vantage point, everyone and everything that existed before you is potentially an ancestor. And that we are family and kin with the whole of reality. That we belong with and to all of reality as one extended family. Isn't that beautiful? That many of us who feel like we don't have a family in today's world, or we come from broken families because of our modern Western or modern culture dynamics around family that often lead to dysfunctional family configurations, can find a deeper sense of connection in the whole of the universe. Because we are a part of an extended family. We are kin with everything, and we all breathe together. And so these ideas come from older cultures who were already deeply connected to the nutrition they were eating that was ancestral, from the virtue of just being diet, to various kinds of movement patterns, to animist traditions, to tribal life ways, to magical practice, and everything in between. And so to them, ancestry was able to take on this broader scope. Now, that's not to say that indigenous and tribal people had it all figured out in this way, because I have seen some very weird ancestral practices from the past that, in my opinion, emerge out of mistaking the fetish for the actual force itself, which is beyond comprehension and in some ways is its own form of mystery. But once we can open the scope of perspective on ancestry to include all of this, we notice a very interesting feature. And that is, ancestry and the ancestral is a deity-like, godlike force in scope. I mean, we are literally on Earth right now and have emerged out of the ancestral. The ancestral is a lineage that always and forever holds us. We are expressions of it. And because of that, we are each nodes within the context of the ancestral. One fire in a long line of fires. So what I want to encourage you to do in that regard is not to fetishize the ancestral only, but to build an altar of fetishes, so to speak. A whole altar dedicated to relating to the ancestral, which can have nutrition on it, which can have movement on it, which can have ancestral life ways on it, magic, ancestral healing and veneration work, and a connection to primal forces in nature as ancestors, even deified ancestors and the mighty dead. Because this connection between the ancestral as a godlike force and the cosmos as ancestor is an understanding indigenous people have, which is why there is often a deification of the ancestral in indigenous and tribal cultures. Because that's the scope we're talking about here. It's not any one of these things alone, but a whole arena, a realm of reality, the ancestral realm. And when we build an altar of many different fetishes, and we understand that each of those represents a vastness that we cannot fully comprehend, then we can have a broader sense of the ancestral in our lives. And I want to encourage you to start to feel the ancestral show up in your world in ways that you don't typically. by feeling a connection to the things and the ways that our ancestors lived, and or when you connect to bigger primal forces. So maybe you feel the ancestral when you look at the stars, or when you watch the moon, perhaps when you walk barefoot outside in nature, maybe when you're eating a particular kind of meal, or you're engaging in a certain kind of movement practice. And let the ancestral start to spill into these various orientations that we have, and to broaden and become something that is just way more mysterious and way more beautiful than any little container that we can fit it in. The container is just a touchstone. It's just a point of reference. It is not the greater mystery held within it. All right, my friends, that's enough for now. And if you have a desire to begin to relate to the ancestral in the kinds of ways we've spoken about today, consider visiting me at my Substack called eatingancientvirtue.substack.com, where we absorb the virtues of the past in order to nourish the future. There are courses and study guides and various other materials that you can work with to deepen your relationship to the ancestral. Take care, my friends.